She met an older man that night. He waited, loved slowly, and she couldn't resist him. Sloane's chisel slipped, scoring a pale scar across the stone frieze where the angel's wing should have curved unbroken. The metallic scrape rang through the sealed chapel like a warning. She froze mid-breath. No footsteps had warned her. No hinge groan, no boot scuff on centuries-old flagstone. Only sudden weight in the air, as if silence had grown a shadow. A man stood at the far end of the nave, hands buried in the pockets of a charcoal coat that carried the faint scent of cedar and rain-soaked wool. He made no move to close the distance. He simply watched her, crouched over the altar, hair slipping from its knot, dust clinging to her sleeves like confession. She rose slowly, brushing white powder from her palms onto worn jeans. The chapel felt smaller now, the cold stone sucking heat from her skin while something warmer coiled low in her belly. He tilted his head the smallest fraction. "You handle old things like you understand their secrets." The words arrived quiet, deliberate, not quite a question, more like he'd noticed something private and decided to name it. Sloane set the chisel down with care, metal clinking against marble. Most people knock. Most people wait for permission. His voice stayed low, unhurried. "You didn't." She felt the observation land like fingers brushing the back of her neck, light, testing, gone before she could decide whether to lean in or away. "This place has been locked for 15 years, she said. "The trust hired me to assess damage, not host strangers." He took one measured step forward, then stopped, respecting an invisible boundary only he seemed to see. "I'm not a stranger." She knew who he was the moment the realization clicked. Rhett Calder, the man whose name appeared in fine print on documents that moved estates and silences. The one who hadn't set foot on this land in over a decade, according to every report she'd read. Yet here he stood, filling the aisle without effort. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. His gaze drifted to her hands again, the faint tremor from hours of controlled pressure, the chalky streaks climbing her forearms like slow rivers. "Neither are you, technically. The chapel was sealed. Restoration requires entry. Curiosity requires more." She crossed her arms, dust sifting between them like pale smoke. The air tasted of old incense, stone, and him, something darker underneath, restrained. He studied her in return, not her face alone. The way she held herself, chin up, shoulders squared, refusing to retreat even an inch. The way her breathing had shallowed without her noticing. Then he turned toward the door, coat whispering against itself. Sloane spoke before thought caught up. "Why come in at all?" He paused back to her, shoulders still, silence stretched taut. When he answered, the words felt pulled from somewhere deeper. "I wanted to see if you'd look away first." Her pulse thudded once, hard against her throat. He glanced over his shoulder just once. Eyes dark, unreadable, patient in a way that felt dangerous. She didn't look away. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click that echoed longer than it should. Sloane stood motionless in the sudden absence. The chisel lay forgotten on the altar cloth. Dust settled again, slower this time. The chapel felt different now, still cold, still ancient, but carrying a new heat that lingered in the places his gaze had touched. She exhaled shaky, and realized she hadn't flinched. Not even once. She didn't know then that he had already decided to wait however long it took for her to come looking. The door's echo hadn't fully died when Sloane heard the low rumble of an engine outside, deep, expensive, receding slowly down the estate's gravel drive. She pressed her palms to the altar's edge, steadying herself against the sudden quiet that felt louder than before. She didn't chase him. Instead, she worked another hour, chipping away at the scarred frieze until her fingers ached and the light through the stained glass turned the color of weak tea. Only then did she pack her tools, lock the chapel behind her, and step into the dusk. The estate sprawled silent under a bruised sky. She followed the path toward the main house, stone walls half swallowed by ivy, windows dark except for one high up in the west wing. A shadow moved behind the glass. She told herself it was nothing. The next morning she returned with her notebook and camera. The chapel door stood ajar. She pushed it open slowly. Rhett was already inside. He stood near the confessional, back to her, studying the cracked paneling as though it owed him an explanation. No coat today, just a dark sweater that clung to shoulders that had clearly carried more years than hers. The air held coffee, faint and black, and the dry warmth of someone who had been waiting. He didn't turn at once. "You came back," he said, voice soft enough to stir dust motes. "I work here." She set her bag down harder than necessary. "You don't." He finally faced her. Morning light carved lines around his eyes, lines she hadn't noticed yesterday in the dim chapel, lines that spoke of nights longer than hers, decisions heavier. "I own it," he said simply. The words landed without flourish. No apology, no explanation, just fact. Sloane felt the floor shift under her. Not fear, not anger, something hotter, sharper. The Calder estate, of course. He inclined his head once. She laughed short without humor. So yesterday wasn't trespassing, it was inspection. Observation. She stepped closer, boots scuffing stone. "And what did you observe?" He looked at her then, really looked. Not at her mouth or her hands or the way her shirt clung from yesterday's sweat. At her eyes, steady, searching. "That you're 23. Her breath caught. She hadn't told him. Hadn't needed to. The math lived in the way she moved, quick, certain, unafraid of being wrong. In the fresh scar on her knuckle from a slip last month. In the way she still believed time bent to people who wanted things badly enough. He hadn't asked her age. He'd simply known. "How?" she said. "Your file, the trust's restoration contract, date of birth listed beside your name." A pause. "I read it after I left." She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. "You looked me up." "I own the estate. I look at everything that touches it." She crossed her arms. "Including me." "Including you." Silence thickened between them, heavy with unsaid things. The chapel smelled of old wood and wax and the faint metallic bite of tools left overnight. Outside, wind rattled the ivy like impatient fingers. He took one step toward her, slow, deliberate, then stopped. "You should want men who rush you," he said, voice low enough she felt it in her chest. Her pulse jumped. "Why?" "Because they won't make you wait." His gaze dropped to her mouth for the briefest second, then lifted again. "I don't rush anything worth keeping." The words hung there, quiet and certain. No promise, no demand, just truth delivered like a blade wrapped in silk. Sloane felt heat climb her throat. Not embarrassment, not desire, not yet. Recognition. He wasn't retreating because he was afraid. He was retreating because he knew exactly what would happen if he didn't. And that knowledge made her skin feel too tight. She turned away first, pretending to study the damaged fresco above the altar. Her fingers brushed stone, cool, unyielding. "You think I'm going to chase something that stands still. I think you'll walk away when you're ready." He stayed where he was, "and I think you'll come back before you're ready to admit why." She glanced over her shoulder. He hadn't moved, hadn't smiled, just watched her with that same devastating patience. She hated how right he felt. She left the chapel without another word, door closing behind her with a soft thud that sounded final. But it wasn't. That afternoon she found a single key on the stone step outside, old iron, worn smooth, attached to nothing. No note, no explanation. She slipped it into her pocket anyway. The metal stayed warm against her thigh long after the sun dropped. And somewhere in the west wing, Rhett poured another coffee he wouldn't finish, listening to the wind and knowing she still carried his key. He hadn't touched her. Not even once. But the waiting had already begun to burn. The key still sat heavy in Sloane's pocket 2 nights later, iron warming against her skin like a secret she hadn't decided to keep. She hadn't returned to the chapel, hadn't called the trust to report the intrusion, had simply driven west instead, toward the coast, toward salt air that might rinse the memory of his voice from her lungs. The auction house crouched low against the cliffs, windows spilling amber into the dark. Inside, the air tasted of old varnish, cigar smoke that had long since faded, and money that never announced itself. Velvet drapes the color of spilled wine absorbed sound until every murmur felt intimate. Low chandeliers dripped light in slow, honey drops across rows of chairs filled with people who knew how to sit still while wanting. Sloane slipped into a seat near the back, coat folded over her arm. She hadn't planned to bid. She'd come because the catalog listed a small oil she'd studied years ago in a university slide deck. Untitled, unsigned, a woman half turned away from the viewer, shoulder bare, light catching the curve of her neck like a held breath. She traced that curve on a library screen once, memorizing the way shadow pooled in the hollow of a collarbone. Seeing it listed here felt like fate daring her to look away. The auctioneer's voice rolled smooth and practiced. Lot after lot passed, porcelain, silver, a jade horse that fetched 6 figures without blinking. Then the painting appeared on the easel. Sloane's fingers tightened on the coat in her lap. She didn't raise her paddle at first. Watched the numbers climb, slow at the start, then sharper. Someone in the front row kept bidding with lazy flicks of a gloved hand. Another countered from the side balcony. Then a new voice cut through, quiet, unhurried, from somewhere closer than she expected. 200,000. Rhett. He sat 3 rows ahead, profile sharp against the glow of the stage lights. Dark suit tonight, no tie, collar open just enough to show the steady pulse at his throat. He hadn't looked back once, hadn't needed to. The room stilled for half a heartbeat. The gloved bidder hesitated, then raised again. Rhett matched without pause. Another bid, another match. The numbers climbed past 300,000 like water rising in a locked room. Sloane felt heat crawl up her neck. Not jealousy, not anger, something tighter, recognition that he knew exactly whose painting this was, knew she'd come. The hammer fell at 420. Sold to paddle 73. Rhett rose without flourish, signed the slip at the side table, then turned. Their eyes met across the velvet sea of chairs. He didn't smile, didn't wave, simply walked toward her through the aisle, the painting now wrapped in soft brown paper under his arm. The room parted without effort. People who recognized power made space. He stopped in front of her seat. She stood slowly, pulse loud in her ears over the soft rustle of departing bidders. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He held the parcel out. "It's yours." She didn't take it immediately. The paper felt warm from his grip. "I can't afford." "I'm not selling it to you." His voice stayed low, meant for her alone. "I don't collect art." She searched his face, those lines around his eyes deeper in this light, the faint silver at his temples catching gold. "Then what do you collect?" He let the silence stretch, just long enough for her to feel it settle against her skin. "Moments," he said finally. The word landed soft, dangerous. She took the painting then, fingers brushing his as the weight transferred. Not a touch. An accident of physics. Still, the contact sparked low in her stomach, brief, electric, gone. He didn't pull away faster than necessary. Didn't linger either. Around them, the room emptied in slow waves. Someone dimmed the chandeliers one bank at a time, until only the stage light remained, pooling at their feet like spilled moonlight. "Why this one?" she asked. "Because you looked at it once like it was still breathing." He stepped half a pace closer, close enough she caught cedar again, mixed with sea salt from the open windows. "And because I wanted to see what you'd do when someone handed it back to you." Her throat tightened. "You think you know what I want." "I think you know what you want." His gaze dropped to her mouth, then rose again, slow, deliberate. The question is whether you'll let yourself take it. She felt the painting's edges press into her palms. Solid, real, more real than the chapel dust or the key still burning a hole in her pocket. She could walk away now. Turn, leave through the side door, drive back to the estate with the painting in her backseat, and his words looping in her head until morning. She didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin. And if I don't? Then I'll wait. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. I'm good at waiting. The last chandelier dimmed. Darkness pressed in, velvet soft, carrying only their breathing and the distant crash of waves below the cliffs. He stepped back first. Drive safe, he said. She watched him disappear through the arched doorway, shoulders straight, pace unhurried. The painting felt heavier than it should. She carried it to her car alone, laid it carefully across the passenger seat, then sat with the engine off for a long minute, fingers tracing the curve of the woman's bare shoulder through the paper. She didn't know then that the real moment he wanted to collect wasn't the painting at all. It was the second she realized she might let him keep her. The painting sat propped against the passenger seat the entire drive back, wrapped paper crinkling every time the car took a curve. Sloane kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the dark road, refusing to glance sideways at the woman half turned away in oil and shadow. She could still feel the ghost of Rhett's fingers brushing hers when he handed it over, deliberate accident, gone in the same breath. The key in her pocket had cooled to room temperature, but the memory of his voice saying "moments" stayed hot under her skin. She didn't unpack the painting that night, left it in the backseat like evidence she wasn't ready to examine. The next morning she arrived at the estate before dawn, gravel crunching under tires still damp from coastal mist. The chapel waited, door unlocked again. Inside, the air carried yesterday's coffee and something sharper, paper, fresh ink. A manila folder lay open on the altar. She approached slowly, pulse already climbing. The top page bore the trust's letterhead dated 3 months earlier. Restoration contract, private chapel, Calder Estate. Her name typed in bold at the top. Below it, a single handwritten note in black fountain pen, precise, slanted slightly left. Recommend Sloane Marrow. She restored the turning glance for the Harrow Collection, 2023. Exact match in sensibility. Initialed RC. Sloane's stomach dropped. The turning glance. Not the anonymous oil from last night. Another painting, one she'd spent 6 weeks with in a climate-controlled vault in London. A woman in half-profile, candlelight licking her shoulder, eyes cast down as though listening to something only she could hear. The piece had belonged to a private collector who never showed his face during handover. She'd assumed corporate. She'd never asked. Now she knew. Her fingers trembled as she flipped pages. Emails, correspondence, a chain stretching back 8 months, Rhett's assistant requesting her portfolio, Rhett himself, signature unmistakable, approving her bid over 2 more experienced firms. One line circled in red ink. Her touch is patient. She waits for the thing to speak first. She slammed the folder shut. Dust puffed upward like startled breath. The chapel door opened behind her. Rhett stepped inside, coat unbuttoned, hair damp from the early rain. He didn't look surprised to find her there. Didn't look guilty either. Just still. Like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had already spent the night walking through it alone. You read it, he said, not a question. Sloane turned, folder clutched against her chest like armor. You didn't hire me for the chapel. I hired you because of the chapel. His voice stayed even. And because of one painting you restored. The turning glance, she forced the words out, your wife's painting. He exhaled once short, controlled, yes. The silence that followed tasted metallic, like blood bitten back. Sloane laughed sharp, brittle. So this, she gestured at the stone walls, the tools, the half-revealed frieze. This is what? A favor, a thank you, or just a way to keep something of her alive through someone else's hands. His jaw tightened, First real crack she'd seen. It was never about using you. Then what was it? She stepped closer, voice dropping. You tracked me down. You made sure I got the job. You watched me work. You bought the painting I once studied and handed it to me like a gift. And all of it, her breath hitched, because I touched something that belonged to her. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. I wanted someone who understood restraint, who wouldn't force the story out of the stone, who would listen first. A pause. I found her in you. The words landed heavier than any touch could have. Sloane felt heat behind her eyes, not tears, not yet. Rage and something worse, recognition. You don't get to decide that. I know. You don't get to orchestrate this, and then stand there like it's fate. I never said it was fate. He took one step forward, then stopped, still respecting that invisible line. I said I waited. She stared at him, saw the lines around his eyes deepen in the weak morning light, saw the way his hand stayed loose at his sides, refusing to reach, saw the man who had controlled every move until this one moment when control slipped. You should have told me. I should have. No defense, just admission. I told myself if I stayed far enough back it wouldn't feel like manipulation, that you'd never know. But I do know now. Yes. She turned away, pressing the folder to the altar so hard the wood creaked. Outside, rain tapped the leaded windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the chapel held its breath. I'm not her, she said quietly. I know you're not. Then stop treating me like a replacement. He closed the distance then, not fast, not aggressive. Just enough to stand behind her, close enough she felt the heat of him against her back without contact. I'm not, he said, voice low enough it vibrated through her ribs. I'm terrified you're not. She spun to face him. Inches separated them. His breathing stayed steady, hers didn't. She searched his face, looking for calculation, for deceit. Found only raw exposure. A man who had spent years building walls and had just handed her the sledgehammer. She stepped around him, toward the door. I need air, she said. He didn't follow, didn't call after her. She walked out into the rain, folder still clutched like proof of betrayal. Water soaked her hair in seconds, cold and relentless. She didn't stop until she reached her car. The painting waited on the passenger seat, still wrapped. She stared at it through the windshield, rain blurring the brown paper into soft ghosts. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, engine off, letting the storm drum against metal while the folder slipped to the floor. And somewhere inside the chapel, Rhett remained exactly where she'd left him, hands empty, waiting again. This time, not sure she would come back. Rain hammered the estate roof like fists on a locked door. Sloane had driven back after dark, telling herself it was only to return the folder, nothing more. The wipers fought uselessly against sheets of water. Headlights carved white tunnels through the black. She parked crooked in the gravel circle, engine ticking down to silence, and sat there gripping the wheel until her knuckles ached. The west wing light burned alone. She should have left the folder on the chapel step. Instead she carried it inside, rain dripping from her coat onto marble that hadn't seen footprints in years. The house smelled of wet stone and cedar smoke. A fire crackled somewhere deeper in. Rhett stood at the tall window in the library, back to the door, watching the storm lash the glass. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't speak, just let the silence stretch until it felt like another presence in the room. She set the folder on the nearest table, careful, deliberate. The wet paper left a dark ring on polished wood. I'm returning this, she said. He finally faced her. Firelight carved half his face in gold, the other in shadow. Rain streaked the window behind him like tears the house refused to shed. You didn't have to come back in this. I didn't come back for you. The lie tasted bitter. I came to close the file. His gaze dropped to the folder, then lifted again, slow, searching. And did you? She crossed her arms against the chill that had nothing to do with wet clothes. I read every page twice. You planned this, every step. Not every step. His voice stayed low, almost lost under the storm. I planned the job, not the rest. The rest being me standing here, soaked, angry, still carrying your damn key. He exhaled once sharp, controlled. I never asked you to keep it. You never asked me to leave either. Silence again, dangerous now, the kind that presses against skin. She took one step closer. Water pooled at her feet. You look at me like I'm already decided, like you've seen the ending and you're just waiting for me to catch up. He didn't deny it. You don't get to look at me like that, she said, quieter, like you already know how this ends. The fire snapped. Outside, wind screamed around the eaves. Rhett moved then, not toward her but to the sideboard where a decanter waited. He poured 2 fingers of amber into a glass, then another, offered the second without looking at her. She didn't take it. He set both glasses down untouched. I know exactly how this ends, he said, voice dropping so low she felt it in her ribs. That's why I tried to stay away. The words landed soft, lethal. Sloane felt something crack inside her chest, not heartbreak, not yet, recognition. Then why didn't you? Because staying away stopped working the moment you refused to flinch. He turned fully to her now. Firelight caught the silver at his temples, the faint scar above his left brow she hadn't noticed before. I watched you in that chapel, dust on your skin, hands steady even when the chisel slipped. You didn't look away, not once. She swallowed. So you decided to test me. I decided to wait. He stepped closer, slow, giving her every chance to retreat. She didn't. Waiting is the only thing I still trust. Rain lashed harder. A branch cracked somewhere outside, loud as gunfire. You're terrified, she said suddenly. He stilled. Of what I'll do when I realize I'm not her. She lifted her chin. Of what you'll do when you realize I'm not going to be careful with you. His jaw flexed. I'm terrified you'll be. The admission hung between them, raw, unguarded. She laughed once short without sound. You think I'll break you? I think you already have. He closed the last distance until only breath separated them. No touch, just heat radiating through soaked fabric. And I let you. Her pulse thundered in her ears, louder than the storm. She could smell rain on him now, clean, sharp, mixed with smoke and restraint that felt like violence held back. I should leave, she whispered. You should. Neither moved. She lifted her hand, slow, until her fingertips hovered an inch from his chest, close enough to feel the steady rise and fall beneath wool, not touching, not yet. His breathing shallowed. You want me to walk away, she said. I want you to choose. His voice cracked on the last word, small, almost invisible. Not because I orchestrated it, not because I waited, because you looked at the ending and still stepped forward. Her hand trembled, she let it fall. Then she turned, fast toward the door. He didn't follow. She made it 3 steps before she stopped. Rain drummed, fire hissed. She looked back. He stood exactly where she'd left him, hands loose, eyes dark, waiting again. She walked back. Not running, not rushing. Just closing the distance. She stopped in front of him, lifted her face. I'm not deciding tonight, she said. I know. But I'm not leaving either. His eyes closed once brief, relieved. When they opened again, something had shifted, not softened, sharpened. She reached up slow, brushed a raindrop from his jaw with her thumb. The contact was electric, brief, gone. He didn't move to catch her hand. She stepped back. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. In the chapel. Where else? She left him there, fire behind him, storm outside, glass still untouched. The folder remained on the table. So did the second drink. And in the hallway, Sloane pressed her back to the wall, heart slamming, realizing she had just chosen the first moment of something she couldn't name yet. something that already hurt. The rain had slowed to a steady drip against the library windows by the time Sloane returned. She hadn't gone far, just to the hallway, where she'd pressed her forehead to cool plaster and tried to remember how breathing worked without his voice in her ears. The house felt smaller now, walls leaning in, firelight flickering through open doors like it knew something she didn't. She walked back. The second glass still waited on the sideboard, untouched. The first one had been drained in the minutes she was gone. She saw the empty crystal catch the glow. Rhett stood where she'd left him, back to the fire, hands in pockets, shoulders carrying the weight of decisions already made. He didn't speak when she entered, didn't turn, just waited until her boots stopped on the rug behind him. She closed the distance without hurry, stopped close enough that the heat of the fire met the chill still clinging to her skin. No words. She lifted her hand again, slower this time, and let her fingertips rest against the wool over his heart. The steady thump beneath answered before either of them could speak. His hand rose then, not fast, not tentative, just certain. He caught her wrist, gentle, thumb settling over the place where her pulse fluttered like trapped wings. He didn't pull her closer. He simply held there, letting her feel the warmth of his palm, the slight callus at the base of his thumb from years of holding things he refused to drop. Her breath hitched, small, involuntary. He felt it. His thumb moved once, slow arc along the blue line under her skin, mapping the rhythm he'd already learned by watching her from doorways and across velvet auction rooms. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped into the space he'd left open. Her free hand found the open collar of his shirt, knuckles brushing warm skin, feeling the faint tremor he couldn't quite hide. He exhaled, long, ragged, and the sound felt like surrender. Then he moved. Not a grab, not a rush. He turned his hand so her wrist slid into his palm, fingers threading through hers until they locked. The other hand rose to cup the side of her face, thumb along her jaw, fingers curling into damp hair at her nape. He tilted her head just enough to meet her eyes. The question lived there, unspoken. She answered by rising on her toes. Their mouths met in the quiet between raindrops. No crash, no urgency that demanded names or explanations. Just the soft press of lips that had waited too long to pretend they hadn't been thinking of this. He tasted like smoke and restraint finally loosening. She tasted like rain and the anger she'd carried all evening, now melting into something warmer, heavier. He didn't deepen the kiss right away. He lingered, mouth moving slow, learning the shape of hers, the way her breath caught when he paused to let her lead. Her hand slid up his chest, fingers curling into fabric, pulling him closer until no air remained between them. His arms circled her waist, steady, anchoring, keeping her there without caging. Time blurred. The fire popped, rain tapped, their breathing filled the rest. When he finally broke the kiss, it was only to rest his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing her in. His thumb traced her lower lip, once reverent, then fell away. She opened her eyes. He was already watching her, not with triumph, not with possession, with something quieter, something that looked like relief edged in fear. She stepped back half a pace, not retreat, just space to breathe. He let her go without resistance. She reached for the buttons of her wet shirt, slow, deliberate, sliding them free until the fabric parted and fell away, landing on the rug with a soft, damp sound. Goosebumps rose on her arms. The fire warmed one side, his gaze warmed the other. He didn't speak, didn't move to help or hinder. He simply watched, eyes dark, patient, letting her choose every inch. When she closed the distance again, he met her halfway. They sank to the rug together, slow, careful, bodies finding places that felt familiar too fast for strangers who had barely touched before tonight. His hands moved with the same restraint he'd always shown, tracing the line of her collarbone, following the curve of her shoulder, pausing at the small of her back to feel her shiver. Every touch deliberate, every pause longer than the one before. She learned the texture of his skin, scarred in places, warm in others. The way his breath stuttered when her fingers found the hollow of his throat. The way he held himself still when she pressed closer, giving her room to decide how deep, how fast. They didn't rush. They lingered. In the spaces between, when breath caught, when hands stilled, when eyes met and held, he chose her again. Not with words, with the way he waited, with the way he let her lead, with the way he finally let restraint become something else entirely. Joyce. Afterward the fire had burned low, embers glowing soft orange. Rain had gentled to a murmur. Sloane lay curled against him, head on his chest, listening to the steady thump that had slowed but never faltered. He didn't move to leave. Didn't reach for clothes scattered across the rug. He simply drew the throw blanket from the nearby chair, slow, careful, and draped it over them both. His arm settled around her shoulders, fingers tracing idle patterns on her upper arm. She felt the rise and fall of his breathing beneath her cheek. He pressed a kiss to her hair, light almost not there. Then he stayed. No promises spoken. No explanations demanded. Just the quiet of two people who had crossed a line they'd both pretended wasn't there, and the simple fact that neither wanted to uncross it yet. She listened to the rain and his heartbeat until both blurred into one rhythm. And for the first time since the chapel door opened, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to break. She felt like she'd already chosen what she'd let break instead. Morning light filtered through the library curtains in thin, pale strips. Sloane woke first, curled against Rhett's side, the throw blanket tangled around their legs, his arm still draped across her waist like it belonged there. His breathing stayed deep and even, the kind of sleep that comes after long restraint finally breaks. She didn't move right away. Just listened to the house settle around them. Distant drip from last night's rain, the faint creak of old beams cooling, his heartbeat steady under her cheek. She slipped from under his arm carefully. He stirred but didn't wake. She found her shirt on the rug, pulled it on over chilled skin, then padded barefoot to the sideboard where the folder still waited, damp edges curled now, ink slightly smudged. She opened it again. Tucked behind the contract pages was something she hadn't noticed before, a single sheet of letterhead dated last week, private sale memorandum, Calder Estate full disposition. The list followed in neat columns: main house, grounds, outbuildings, contents including the private chapel and its fixtures. Appraised value circled in red. Buyer interest noted from 3 parties. Closing proposed within 90 days. Her stomach turned cold. She carried the page to the window, held it to the light. The chapel was itemized separately. Restored elements to remain in situ unless otherwise negotiated. But the note beneath, Rhett's handwriting, read, all movable assets to be catalogued and removed prior to transfer. The paintings, the frieze fragments she'd begun to piece back together, the altar cloth still bearing faint chalk from her hands. Everything. She looked back at him, still asleep, face half turned into the cushion, lines softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability he'd never shown her awake. She crossed the room, knelt beside him, set the page on the low table where he would see it first. Then she waited. He woke slowly, eyes opening to find her sitting on the rug, knees drawn up, watching him, the paper between them like a drawn line. He sat up without hurry, blanket pooling at his waist, read the page once, then again, no surprise on his face, only quiet resignation. "You were going to tell me," she said, not a question. Eventually, his voice came rough from sleep, after the chapel was finished, after you'd moved on to the next restoration. She felt the words like a slap, soft, careful, devastating. "You're selling it." "Yes. Everything." He met her eyes, everything. She stood then, fast enough that the blanket slid away. including the chapel, the work I've done, the things I've touched." He didn't flinch. "The chapel stays, the structure, the fixed elements, but the movable pieces, the ones you've been bringing back to life, they go with the sale. That's standard." "Standard?" She laughed once, sharp, hollow. "You hired me to restore something you planned to dismantle." "I hired you to restore something that deserved care." He rose slowly, reaching for his shirt but not putting it on yet, just holding it. "I never lied about that." "You lied about why." She stepped closer. "You're not selling because you need the money, you're selling because of me." He went still. She saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened on the fabric. Confirmation. "You're running," she said quietly, "from this, from us." He exhaled, long, controlled. "I'm not running from the age between us. That stopped mattering the moment you walked back into this room last night." "Then what?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "What are you so afraid of?" He looked at her then, really looked, eyes dark, unguarded. "I'm afraid of loving again." The admission landed heavier than rain on stone. She felt it settle in her chest, cold, sharp, true. "I lost someone once," he said, voice low. "I buried her in the family plot behind the chapel. I sealed the doors after. I told myself the quiet was penance. Then you arrived, 23 fearless hands that listened to broken things, and I realized I wasn't finished breaking." He stepped closer, not touching, just close enough she could feel the heat still clinging to his skin. "I won't be the man who steals your future," he said. "You're young. You have years to build things that last. I have years of things that didn't. If I stay, if I let this become permanent, I'll pull you into my silences, my ghosts, and one day you'll wake up realizing you traded your light for my shadows." She stared at him, saw the man who had waited so long he'd forgotten how to stop, saw the fear behind the patience, not of her youth but of what loving her might cost them both. "You think I can't choose my own shadows?" she asked. "I think you shouldn't have to." She reached out slow, placed her palm flat against his chest. His heart thudded hard beneath her hand. "I'm not asking you to keep the estate," she said. "I'm asking you to stop deciding my future for me." His hand covered hers, warm, steady. "And if I don't sell?" "Then we figure out what happens when two people who have both lost things try to keep something new." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the resignation had cracked, replaced by something rawer, hope edged in terror. "I need time," he said. "You've had years of time." Her thumb brushed once across his skin. "Now you get days, weeks, whatever it takes, but you don't get to run without telling me first." He nodded once small. She stepped back, let her hand fall. "I'll be in the chapel tomorrow," she said. "Same time, same work." He didn't answer, just watched her gather her coat, her keys, the damp folder. She paused at the door. "When you decide," she said, "don't make the choice alone." Then she left. The house stayed quiet behind her. Rain started again, soft, steady, washing the windows clean. And in the library, Rhett stood alone with the sale memorandum in his hand, staring at the place on the rug where they'd finally stopped waiting. He didn't tear the page. Not yet. But he didn't sign it either. Sloane left the library without looking back. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded final in the quiet house. Rain still pattered against the windows, softer now, like the storm had spent itself and only remembered to breathe. She drove home through fog that clung to the road like regret. The key he'd left on the chapel step sat in the center console, iron, heavy, no longer warm. She didn't touch it, didn't throw it out the window either, just let it ride there between them like an unanswered question. The next morning she woke before dawn, made coffee she didn't drink, opened her laptop. The email had arrived 3 days earlier, buried under restoration reports and supplier invoices, but she hadn't opened it until now. Fellowship notification, European Heritage Conservation Program. Location, Florence, Italy. Duration, 18 months. Specialization, early Renaissance ecclesiastical frescoes and stone restoration. Start date, 6 weeks from acceptance. She stared at the screen until the words blurred. She typed her acceptance in under 2 minutes, hit send before doubt could catch up. Then she sat back, hands flat on the table, and felt the shift inside her chest, not relief exactly. Resolve. The kind that comes when you realize staying would cost more than leaving. She didn't tell him right away. For the next 3 weeks she returned to the chapel every day, worked in silence, chipped away at the frieze until the angel's wing curved clean again, cleaned the altar stone until it gleamed like new forgiveness. She didn't look for him in the doorway, didn't pause when she heard boots on gravel outside. If he came, he stayed hidden. If he watched, he did it from shadows she refused to chase. The distance felt deliberate, necessary. He felt it too. One afternoon she found fresh coffee on the chapel step, black, still hot, no note. She left it untouched until it cooled. The next day, a single white camellia lay beside the thermos. She carried it inside, placed it on the altar beside her tools. Didn't throw it away. Didn't press it between pages either. Just let it sit there until the petals browned at the edges. He never spoke of the sale again. The memorandum disappeared from the library table. Whether he'd torn it, burned it, or simply filed it away, she didn't ask. She finished the chapel on a Thursday. The last piece, a small marble dove missing its beak, was set into place with careful mortar. She stepped back, dusted her hands, surveyed the space. Light poured through the cleaned windows, turning dust motes into gold. The air smelled of clean stone and wax and something quieter, completion. She locked the door behind her for the last time, left the key in the iron lock, not the one he'd given her, that one she carried to the main house. She found him in the conservatory, glass walls fogged from the morning chill, orchids blooming in careful rows. He stood with his back to her, studying a bloom the color of old bruises. She set the iron key on the wrought iron table between them. "I finished," she said. He turned slowly, eyes moving from the key to her face. No surprise, only the kind of stillness that comes before something irrevocable. "You did." She nodded once. "The trust will sign off next week, everything fixed, everything in place." He didn't move closer, didn't reach for the key. She took a breath. "I accepted a fellowship, Florence, 18 months. The silence stretched long enough for her to hear her own pulse. His jaw flexed once, then settled. "When do you leave?" 5 weeks. He looked at the key again. "You're not coming back." "Not for a while." He exhaled, slow, controlled. "And if I asked you to stay?" She met his eyes steady. "I'd ask you why." He didn't answer immediately, just studied her. The faint scar on her knuckle from the chisel slip weeks ago, the way her shoulders squared even when her hands trembled at her sides, the quiet certainty in her gaze that hadn't been there the first day he walked into the chapel. "I thought I was protecting you," he said finally. "From me, from this place, from becoming another thing I couldn't keep." "I know what you thought," her voice stayed even. "I also know what I chose." He stepped forward then, slow, until the table pressed against his thighs. "I could stop the sale, keep the estate, wait." "You could," she didn't flinch, "but you'd still be waiting, and I'd still be the reason you stayed." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had cracked, small, visible only to someone who'd learned to read his silences. "I don't want to be the man who clips your wings," he said. "Then don't." She reached across the table slow, placed her hand over his where it rested near the key. No grip, just contact, warmth shared for a long heartbeat. "I'm not running," she said. "I'm going, there's a difference." His thumb brushed once across her knuckles, small, deliberate. Then he turned his hand palm up, let her fingers settle into his. "I'll be here," he said, quiet, certain, "when you decide what you want next." She felt the words settle deep, weightless and heavy at once. I know. She withdrew her hand first, not abrupt, controlled. She walked to the glass door, paused with her palm on the handle. Don't sell the camellia, she said without turning. It's still alive. Then she stepped outside. The conservatory door closed behind her with the same soft click as the library door weeks before. Rhett remained where he stood. He stared at the empty space she'd left, table, key, orchids still blooming like nothing had changed. The conservatory smelled of wet earth and green leaves and the faint trace of her, stone dust, rain, resolve. For the first time in years, the house felt too large. He didn't pick up the key. He simply sat in the wrought iron chair she'd stood beside, elbows on knees, hands clasped, staring at the place where her fingers had rested in his. Outside, the sky cleared for the first time in days. Sunlight slanted through the glass, warming the back of his neck. He didn't move for a long time. And in the quiet that followed, the man who had always waited finally understood what it felt like to be the one left behind. Not dramatically. The exhibition hall in Florence smelled of fresh plaster and linseed oil, the kind of scent that clings to restored stone and new beginnings. Sloane stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching clusters of people move through the dimmed space. Her final piece dominated the center, a life-sized photograph of the chapel's restored frieze, angel wings complete, dove beak mended, lit from below so the marble seemed to breathe. The plaque beneath reads simply, Private Chapel, Calder Estate. Restored by Sloane Merrow, 2025. On loan from the Merrow Restoration Trust. 18 months had passed since she walked out of the conservatory. 18 months of frescoes in dim basilicas, of stone dust in her hair, of nights when she woke reaching for a warmth that wasn't there. She had not called him. He had not written. The silence between them had grown deliberate, careful, like a wound allowed to close on its own terms. She had almost convinced herself it was finished. The crowd thinned as the evening wore on. She excused herself from a conversation with a curator, something about funding for the next cycle, and stepped outside onto the narrow balcony overlooking the Arno. The river moved slow and black under streetlights. She leaned against the iron railing, breathing in cool October air that tasted of river stone and distant wood smoke. Footsteps behind her, measured, familiar. She didn't turn at first. Rhett stopped a careful distance away. No coat tonight, just a dark sweater against the chill, collar turned up. The silver at his temples had spread, but the lines around his eyes looked softer in this light, less carved by years of holding everything in. You kept the camellia, she said without looking at him. It's in the conservatory window, still alive. She finally faced him. The city glow caught the faint scar above his brow. He looked older, not worn, just lived in, steady. You're here, she said. I'm here. A long beat of quiet. River water lapped stone below them. I saw the plaque inside, he said. The trust, my name on it. She lifted her chin. I didn't ask for that. I know. He slipped his hands into his pockets, habit, not nerves. I didn't sell the estate. She felt the words land like cool water on fevered skin. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. I turned it over to a public trust, he continued. The chapel stays open, guided tour twice a week. The paintings remain on site. The grounds are being replanted, native species, no chemicals. Your name is on the founding documents. Sloane Merrow Restoration Trust. Irrevocable. She stared at him. The railing felt suddenly cold under her palms. Why? He stepped closer, slow, giving her room to step back. She didn't. Because you gave me back something I buried, he said, voice low, rough at the edges. I sealed that chapel after she died because I couldn't bear to see anything live in it again. I thought closing doors was the same as keeping safe. Then you walked in, 23, fearless, hands that listened, and you made the stone speak. You made me remember what listening felt like. He exhaled once short, controlled. I spent months convincing myself I was protecting you by letting you go, that if I sold everything I'd be noble, selfless. Then I realized I was just afraid of loving someone who might leave, afraid of building something that could break again. He met her eyes direct, unguarded. I'm not letting fear take it again. The river kept moving below them. Somewhere in the hall, a string quartet began a slow, aching piece, violin notes floating out through open doors. Sloane felt heat behind her eyes. Not tears. Not yet, just pressure, years of restraint meeting its mirror. You could have written, she said quietly. I could have. No defense, just truth. I told myself you needed space, time, the freedom I thought I was giving you by staying silent, but mostly I was afraid you'd say no, or worse, that you'd say yes and then realize what you'd taken on. She laughed once soft, surprised. You thought I'd run from you. I thought I'd ruin you. She studied him then, really looked. Saw the man who had waited so long he'd learned how to wait even when it hurt. Saw the small tremor in his fingers where they curled in his pockets. Saw the quiet courage it took to stand here, months later, with nothing guaranteed. She stepped forward, slow, until the space between them shrank to breath. I finished the fellowship, she said. I could have stayed, another cycle, another city, but I kept thinking about the chapel, about the way light hits the altar at noon, about the camellia in the window, about you standing in the conservatory looking at orchids like they owed you answers. His breathing shallowed. I'm not coming back to be saved, she said. I'm coming back because I want to see what happens when two people stop waiting and start building. He closed his eyes once brief, relieved, then opened them again. I kept your tools, he said. In the chapel, exactly where you left them, the chisel with the chipped handle, the soft brush you used on the frieze. She smiled, small, real, sentimental. Terrified. She reached up slow, brushed her thumb along his jaw, feeling the faint stubble, the warmth beneath. I'm not afraid of your ghosts, she said. I'm not afraid of your future. The violin inside swelled, aching, hopeful. She rose on her toes. Their mouths met in the quiet between river sounds, not desperate, not rushed, just certain. His hands found her waist, gentle, anchoring, pulling her closer until no space remained. She felt the steady thump of his heart against hers, faster now, no longer restrained. When they parted, foreheads resting together, she whispered against his mouth. Take me home. He exhaled, shaky, relieved. Only if you promise to keep breaking things, he said, so I have something to fix with you. She laughed soft into his neck. Deal. They stood there a long minute, city lights on water, music drifting, two people who had finally stopped letting fear write the ending. Inside the hall, the crowd began to thin. The quartet played on. Rhett took her hand, fingers threading through hers, firm, no hesitation. They walked back through the doors together. The plaque still glowed under soft light. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were looking at something borrowed. They stepped back into the exhibition hall hand in hand. The quartet had finished. People drifted toward coat racks and murmured goodbyes. Sloane's photograph of the chapel still glowed in the center of the room, wings spread, dove whole, light falling exactly as she remembered it falling on a certain autumn afternoon when she first locked eyes with Red across stone and dust. No one stopped them, no one needed to. Outside, Florence had turned quiet. Street lamps cast long amber pools on wet cobblestones. Rhett walked beside her without hurry, thumb brushing once across her knuckles, small, deliberate, the same motion he'd used months ago in the library when restraint still ruled every touch. They didn't speak until they reached the Ponte Vecchio, river dark and steady beneath them. She leaned against the parapet, watching reflections fracture and reform. He stood close, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she felt the warmth of him against the October chill. I kept imagining this, she said quietly, coming back, finding the chapel empty, finding you gone. I kept imagining you staying away, he answered, finding someone who didn't carry ghosts in every silence. She turned her face toward him. Did you look? Once, his voice stayed low. A year ago, a conservator in Lisbon, brilliant, 31, no ghosts of her own. He exhaled once short, rueful. I left before dessert. Couldn't stop seeing your hands on stone. Couldn't stop hearing the way you said my name when you were angry. She smiled, small, real. You're impossible. I know. Wind moved across the river, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and wet stone. She reached up, slow, traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. He caught her wrist gently, turned her palm to his mouth, pressed a kiss to the faint scar from the chisel slip years ago. I don't need you to be younger, he murmured against her skin. I need you to be mine. The words landed soft, certain, not a vow carved in haste, just truth spoken in the space between breaths. She felt something loosen inside her chest, something that had stayed knotted since the first time he walked into the chapel and watched her work without apology. I already am, she said. He lifted his head, eyes dark, searching, then come home. She didn't answer with words. She simply stepped into him, arms around his waist, cheek against his chest. His heartbeat answered hers, steady now, no longer racing to outrun itself. They stayed like that until the bridge emptied and the city quieted further. Then they walked, slow, toward the small pensione she'd rented near the station. No rush. No need to prove anything tonight. The next morning, they took the first train north. The estate looked different under winter light. Ivy stripped back, stone walls bare and honest, the chapel roof newly repaired with slate that caught pale sun like quiet silver. Red had kept the key to the iron gate. He unlocked it without flourish, held the gate open for her. Inside, the air smelled of clean mortar and wax. Her tools waited exactly where she'd left them, chisel with the chipped handle, soft brush, small palette knife. Dust had settled again, thin and patient. He closed the door behind them. No words at first. She walked to the altar, ran her fingers along the now smooth stone. He followed, slow, stopped behind her. She felt him there, presence more than proximity, then felt his hands settle lightly on her hips. She leaned back into him. His chin rested on her shoulder. It waited for you. It waited for us. He turned her gently. They faced each other in the aisle, light falling through stained glass in soft reds and golds. No audience, no need for performance. She reached up slow, slid her fingers into his hair. He bent his head. Their mouths met, gentle, lingering, the kind of kiss that carries memory and promise in equal measure. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm keeping the estate, he said. Not as a monument, as a place we can keep restoring, together. No deadlines, no buyers, just time. She smiled against his mouth. And the trust. Still in your name. You'll run it when you're ready, or we'll run it together, or we'll let someone else learn how to listen to stone. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. I don't care about the title. I care about the mornings we wake up here. She nodded once small. They moved to the frieze together. She picked up the chisel. He handed her the mallet without being asked. They worked side by side, not rushing, not speaking much. Just the soft tap of metal on stone, the brush of sleeves, the occasional brush of fingers when they reached for the same tool. At one point she paused, dust on her cheek, hair slipping from its knot, and looked at him. He was watching her again. Same way he'd watched that first day, quiet, reverent, no longer hiding the want behind restraint. She smiled, unguarded, easy. He reached out, slow, brushed the dust from her cheek with his thumb. Then he leaned in, kissed the corner of her mouth, light, lingering. They kept working. Hours passed. Light shifted across the floor. The chapel grew warmer, not from fire but from shared breath, shared silence, shared choice. When the sun dropped low enough to paint the walls rose gold, they stepped back. The frieze gleamed, whole breathing theirs. She set the chisel down, turned to him. He took her hand, fingers threading through hers, then drew her close. No grand declarations. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had finally chosen each other without needing to outrun time. They walked out of the chapel together, door left open behind them, light spilling across the threshold like an invitation that would always remain. Outside, the camellia in the conservatory window had bloomed again, white petals against dark glass. They paused on the path. He lifted her hand to his mouth, kissed her knuckles once. She leaned into his side, head on his shoulder. The estate stretched quiet around them, stone, ivy, sky turning the color of promise. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were waiting for anything at all. They were simply home,